Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 106, and Maggie and I return to our new video project, our discussion of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice as an exemplar of, issues with adaptation. So
Issues feels negative.
issues does feel negative, yes.
As a
Opportunities,
study of
yes. As a
adaptation.
study of adaptation.
Study of adaptation.
Yes, a study of adaptation. That is a much
We
better way
wanted
of
the
describing.
chance to dig a little bit deeper than we usually get to, so this is what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start off with sharing a few things because by chance, had this awesome opportunity this past weekend. My wife and I went to New York City for the 4th of July in order to see the Jane Austen at 250 exhibit at the Morgan Library. Currently, it's a traveling exhibit. It's currently at the Morgan. I don't think it's traveling very many places, unfortunately. But it was very cool, and it was showcasing a lot of Austen's manuscript stuff, especially many of her letters and like first editions of the text, and kind of walking through kind of her background and her life and the reception of her books and things. It was a very interesting way to do some research on the publication history of her books. And also to learn several interesting new facts. One of which is that Jane Austen was tall. She's like 5'9", easy. One of her dresses was standing there, and my wife was standing next to it, like, dang. My wife's not short. My wife's 5'5", like she's like pretty much average height for a woman, and taller than many. But like Jane Austen would have like had many inches over her.
I kind of love that for her. She should be towering as
Yeah,
she enters the
she
room.
was tall. She wasn't like 6 feet, but she was
Yeah, but
well
of the
above average.
time,
And
like,
at the time, yeah, she must
yeah,
have been.
exactly. I'm like, she would be like me running into a 6'4" woman now,
You'd
right?
think, right? I mean, it was yeah. So anyway, that was one kind of interesting thing. Another was, so there was one of her letters that she wrote from a trip to London that she took not long after the publication of Pride and Prejudice. And Maggie, I was immediately thinking of our conversation about physical descriptions and about differences between visual adaptations and book adaptation and book adaptations and books, right? And this was the fascinating thing to me. Apparently, Jane Austen had a very precise physical, like, although she does not try to represent it in her text, she had a very precise mental picture of what all of her characters looked like. And when she was in London, that is, normally she lived a fairly quiet life in a fairly small village. But when she was in London and surrounded by teeming hordes of people, what she loved to do was just look at people watch, basically. So she would be people watching. And in her letter to her sister Cassandra, which is so many of her letters were to Cassandra, she reported back. She was standing there in London looking at the crowds, looking at the women, and trying to find, like, basically trying to cast Jane Elizabeth. And she was so excited because she was like, I found someone who is the exact picture of Mrs. Bingley. Like, she is Mrs. In fact, she then went on to say, and seeing her proved what I had always suspected, which is that Jane would look really good in green, and it was probably her favorite color. Because the woman was wearing green, and she was like, I mean, she was like, she was perfect, everything, and she didn't describe exactly what it looked like, but she was describing the elements of this woman's face.
Yeah.
She's like the shape of the face, the jawline, the eyes, the hair, exactly like Jane. And she found another who is like not quite as dead a ringer for Elizabeth, but like who is a fair approximation. And she was like, Elizabeth probably liked yellow. Anyway, but just like seeing Jane Austen describing her own visual imagination of these things, and the fact that she was like actually casting in her head, like she was doing that process.
Actively going through those motions to stand there and find actual people. Like,
Yeah.
I wonder if which came first, like did she feel like she kind of knew them well enough already and had written the text that she could then cast, or was she like looking for them and then those people would speak to her? Like, I love just the order of that too.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because again, there were the ways that it was phrased was really fascinating. Like the thing about the color green was one of my favorite sentences in that whole letter, because she had talked about how she had suspected that Jane liked green and looked good in it, but she wasn't sure until she saw this woman wearing green and was like, oh yeah, no, that can. So it wasn't like that decides me that I'm going to definitely imagine, but she's like, it confirmed my suspicion, were her words.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah, like the characters were real and it was now official.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she, like, so the character of, Jane Bingley, née Bennett, was real in her mind, and she had always had a picture of her, but of course, like, she'd never actually seen it in the flesh, and so been able to sort of judge it from outside. And this, this spotting of this woman enabled her to like do this kind of objective assessment, to like see Jane in action, right? Basically. And just, there is something so like proto-cinematic about that process.
That's what I was just thinking. I was like, look, she's world building. Like, she's creating the space so she can exist and the story can exist more fully. And that's exactly what we do in filmmaking when you put together the details so thoroughly that you can't question the validity. Like, I have thought through every detail.
Right.
So you are lost in this story.
Yeah. But it also, like, I think of the... I'm trying to be, I'm going through the unusual process of trying to be cautious about what I say, but I think that there can be a fake dichotomy in people's minds. Like, people consider themselves book people and not movie people, right? It can feel like as if the process of a visual adaptation like destroys something, and it does fix things, as we've said, right? Like, once, if you are watching the BBC Pride and Prejudice, Colin Firth is Mr. Darcy, and if that's not what Mr. Darcy looks like in your head when you're reading the book, you have to either stop watching the film or live with Colin Firth, right? Which is a prospect not daunting for many people, but anyway, like, that's... But there's a lot of times so I think that sometimes people have this kind of false dichotomy of like the book experience is different than that, or like that there's something that going through the process of visually fixing things is something that kind of, I don't know what, ruins it or something like that. But just the fact that Jane Austen was herself doing this with her characters, that she had so fixed an idea of them. This was true of Tolkien too, right? I mean, this of course came out, the chapter in Nature of Middle-earth. So it's some stuff that Christopher hadn't released before. But in Nature of Middle-earth, we got his written response to Pauline Baynes. When Pauline Baynes illustrated the Company of the Ring, she like did little like portraits of each of the Company of the Ring. And Tolkien sees them and he's like, no, that's wrong. That is not what they look like. And then he gives her like, bam, like this is exactly what they looked like, because he had clear mental pictures down to like Boromir is 6'4", Aragorn is 6'6", Gandalf is shorter than Jane Austen. Like he had all of these things, which he is, by the way. Like he had all of these things, so again, like he had these clear mental pictures, and so he didn't like paint authoritative pictures of them, though he could have done. He was a painter, right? He could have done that, but he didn't do that. He doesn't spend much time in the book. Like, you could read the books and be forgiven for coming away with a totally different mental picture than he had. But despite so again, both of them had this in common. Both Tolkien and Austen had these two facts in common: that they gave very little physical description. They spend very little time in actual physical description of their character. She did not try in words to capture what Jane's jawline looked like and the shape of Jane's eyes. Like, she didn't try to capture that in her story. And yet, fact number 2, she had a very clear, detailed, and set visual idea of what they looked like. And the same was true of Tolkien.
I mean, no, I haven't read enough of Jane Austen's contemporaries. Maybe you have. Like, Was that unique? Like, was physical description something that we would have expected to get in text? Because I'm starting to wonder, like, was this like what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, did we not start getting really visual descriptions until there was cinema?
So this would be a really interesting study, and it's
Yeah.
possible that someone's done this and I don't know it. But it would be really interesting to see how physical descriptions of characters changed
Changed with
post
cinema.
cinema. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And especially post, well, I was going to say post the beginning of adaptation, but since adaptations were some of the very earliest films, that's
Earliest
no
ones, yeah.
gap. Um, I mean, like, Nosferatu, right? Okay, well, there we are. Adaptation has begun already, right?
Here we are.
So, anyway, but because I do think that it makes a change, right? When authors now have, and it's not even just of people, right? The more authors as they're writing have their own imaginations formed by like establishing
Yeah.
shots, right? Like, to what extent have they begun, even unconsciously, to work like descriptions of establishing shots into their prose, right? In ways that a pre-cinematic writer would never have even thought to do. So yeah, I mean, I haven't done that kind of study enough to see. I mean, all I'm doing right now is just kind of like thinking of other, like 19th century novelists,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. And I mean, it varies very much. I mean, if you think about like Dickens' descriptions versus like Charlotte Bronte's or something like that, like there's a lot of variation in how much is described.
Mm-hmm.
But and it's true, Phil, that people were putting stories on the stage for ages before that. So that is a visual
Yeah.
adaptation still as well. Um, it's and I wonder. See, that's just another study yet.
That's
Like,
a separate study. I'm like, well, that's
yeah,
also very interesting, but it is more limited to the actors of the day, and that's probably more influenced by what has come before because they were so insular, right?
yeah,
Like there weren't people that traveled around seeing theater from all over different continents. Like the accessibility of cinema
yeah.
broadened the scope of who you could have. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't be a little bit more particular with casting, but you'd be a little more limited probably.
Yeah, and then of course you've got sets and like the um I would think that well, who knows? I don't know. Like, it's there's a lot there. There's a lot
There's a lot you can play with.
there,
It's a fun
there's a lot
thought.
there to study. Yeah.
But I love hearing that Jane Austen had built that world in her head so thoroughly that it allowed us to get lost in it, but didn't impose that prescriptive description on
Yeah.
us. Like, I wonder if that was purposeful as well. We probably won't find out. But really interesting that we're able to create what we want to create. And we have in these adaptations two very different versions
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Lizzie and Jane
Yeah.
and everybody else.
And I do think, by the way, that the woman that she found who was the perfect Jane was probably an older woman, like not 23 or whatever, because she
Hmm.
called her Mrs. Bingley. I found the perfect Mrs. Bingley, is what she
Oh,
said
wow.
to Cassandra. So I think the woman she saw must have been in like her late 20s or 30s or something like that. So she's imagining her as
Okay,
the
that's
married
even
Jane.
cooler. So she like fan fictioned her
Yeah,
own.
exactly. There's like a
I
fan fiction
love
element there.
that.
Yes, this is what Jane would have looked like 10 years later. Yeah, I think so.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah,
That's so great.
yeah, yeah. No, it's very cool.
Running around with little Bingleys and
Yeah, yes, yeah, yeah. She didn't go into any more detail than like her face and clothes,
yeah.
but that was
Oh,
really,
that's so cool.
that was very cool. Um,
Sure.
yeah, the
Right.
the other thing that was relevant to the discussion we were having last time that I was learning was it was an excellent refresher course in the publication history of Jane Austen's novels, and there were two really salient things about that. One is the order. So the very first of Jane Austen's novels that was published was Sense and Sensibility. That was published in 1811. Pride and Prejudice was number 2. So Pride and Prejudice was, and now Northanger Abbey was the first one written, but it was the last one published. Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published together in 1818 or 1819 at the very end. I think they may even come out after she died. But anyway, they came out at the very end. So like placing Northanger Abbey chronologically first is something that didn't happen for a long time. So it was Sense and Sensibility first, and then Pride and Prejudice, and then Mansfield Park, and then Emma, and then Persuasion and Northanger Abbey together. And so they were coming out pretty frequently. The other thing is that like this was novel writing. This was very early, still very early days in novel writing as like an industry. And especially as a woman, female novels, like female novels written by women, were already almost like a subgenre of novels, even by this time, even by like the early 19th century. Phil, they started calling them novels in the 1800s. The first novels were like Pamela was pretty much the first novel. Robinson Crusoe also. Robinson Crusoe and Pamela are like the beginning of the novel genre. Anyway, so second half of the 18th century, it starts becoming really popular. And there were in the 18th century already significant several female authors whose works were very, very very popular, including very prominently Fanny Burney, who is one of Jane Austen's personal favorites. And in fact, another really cool thing they had at the exhibit was they in the early days of novel publication, one of the things that they did, it was they collected subscribers. It was kind of like the Kickstarter basically for novels. Like a publisher would collect subscribers who would give money towards this, and then they would get included in the opening credits, just like Kickstarter.
Perfect.
Exactly. So so Jane Austen actually personally subscribed to Camilla by Fanny Burney. So she financially supported one of and she's in the list. Like J. Austen from Steventon is in the list of subscribers to I think it was Camilla, the Fanny Burney novel.
Cool.
And she alludes to several of Fanny Burney. So she had role models. So like Jane Austen did not invent novel writing, she did not invent novel writing by women. That was but there was already, it will shock no one to hear that novels written by women were not given the same respect. And Jane Austen often both within her fiction and outside of it, was, commented on the fact that like these, like Fanny Burney is at least as good as Sir Walter Scott, who was, very, very famous. He was kind of the gold standard of literary writers at that time, writing poetry and writing prose. And she wasn't a huge fan of Scott at all. But he was the big, like, mainstream, success story. Anyhow, so, but publishing still wasn't something that you did like for fame, and like you didn't do it become a rock star. Like you didn't get rich and famous from writing novels. Generally, very few people did, especially women writers. So she basically sold the rights to her novels to a publisher. She didn't receive any royalties or anything for her novels at all. Like no residuals, no royalties. She did receive like one lump sum. It was basically just like getting her in the door, like getting her published at all was like, it was like, we'll pay you this and we'll promise to publish them. But for that reason, because she had sold the rights, her own name was not attached to the books at all. So in 1811, when Sense and Sensibility appeared, it was called Sense and Sensibility by a Lady. That's just by a lady is what
Did you hear that eye roll?
is what the byline was for that. So, which tells you something. Not only like they didn't care who she was,
Yeah.
nobody knew anyway, so they didn't care who she was. But they did want to announce that this was a book written by a woman because there was obviously a market for this, right?
But they didn't want to give any credit to that woman. So
No.
we don't want you to, like, we don't actually care what the name is. Like,
No.
you shouldn't care what the name is, but it's a woman.
Exactly. So all of you young ladies out there who read novels, which was a substantial percentage of the novel reading population, they knew they were selling a lot of their books to women who might be interested to read a book by a woman. And so they stamped that all over the place. By a lady. But we don't care who it was.
Right.
And then afterwards, they did bill it. So when Pride and Prejudice, on the title page of the first edition of Pride and Prejudice, is Pride and Prejudice by the author of Sense and Sensibility. And then it kept doing that. It kept doing that. So for later ones, they would refer back to the earlier ones as like, so that you could tell it was by the same person. So it was able to follow it, the thread.
And you never once get Jane Austen's name?
No, not on any of her first editions. Yeah, her name doesn't appear anywhere in any of her first editions. That started happening later.
All the way back, and if you trace it all the way back to their first book, it's just a lady.
By a lady, yeah, exactly.
So do you think, I mean, would there have been a real draw for authors in that era to write for money, for not fame? Or is it purely just a hobby that you can get a little pocket money with? Like, she had such a drive as a writer, like, you know, so prolific, so productive, that you can't argue that she was born to do this, and she was very much a passionate writer and very good, obviously. But, like, would there be some sort of, like, social drive for her to do this as well?
Like a social drive in the sense of, like, her wanting to accomplish something through doing it? Yeah, I mean... Certainly,
like, would you bring this up at a party? I'm a novelist.
Right. I see. Well, I don't get the impression Jane Austen went to many of that kind of party.
Yeah, that's true.
Like she was, she was. I don't know. She was. Sorry.
Would one bring this up at a party?
Yeah,
you know, like,
I think so. I don't think that she concealed it. Like, I don't think that she was trying to hide her identity, or that she was trying to forswear it, or, like, you know, that she pretended to be something else and didn't let on that she was the author of those novels. Like, I don't know Jane Austen's biography that much, and there may be evidence that she did that kind of thing, but I don't think so.
We're also totally off topic, but I'm very curious about this now. So yeah.
Yeah. No, it is interesting, and it clearly became known. But I mean, unfortunately, she died so young that, I mean, I think that had she lived another several decades, as she well might have done, had she not gotten ill, had she lived another few decades, I think that she would have become very famous, you know, in her own right, and that later editions, later editions did, like, carry her name because her name became known. And became very famous. I think she would have been famous in her lifetime, as some others did. Like Charlotte Bronte was famous in her lifetime, even though she actively published it under a pseudonym at first, right, and only later on kind of came out of the closet. The Bronte sisters published under male pseudonyms at first. Because they felt the bias against female authors was so strong, or that it was going to be, like, shoved into a corner where they didn't want it to be. Like, basically, they wanted their books to be read as if they had been written by a man, and then only later it was revealed that they were written by women. Yeah, Currer Bell, I believe that's it, Phil. Yeah, I think that was Charlotte. I forget Emily's, but this is one of these things that I don't remember because, like, I can always ask my wife and I know she knows. So, like, I have a whole category of things that I'm just, that, like, I don't need to save space in my own brain because, like,
it makes me happy that there's somebody in your house that knows more than you about something.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Great. Yes. My wife knows more than me about many things, even apart from great. Like professional matters. But yes. Yeah. Wow. No, I can always come to her with any question about Victorian novels or Tudor history. But anyway, so So yeah, so and this is just to kind of flesh out, as we were discussing last time, to flesh out some of the sort of moment of her publication and what that meant. 'Cause we were talking about comparing the moments, and if there's a thing that Austen wanted to accomplish, I think. I get the feeling, and now again here I'm treading onto ground that is dangerous for me. One impression that I get that I think is different between like the Brontes and Jane Austen, and they were not immediately contemporary. The Brontes were like, a generation later. But the Brontes wanted to make a name for themselves. Like they were like, all of them were like personally ambitious, right? And they were supportive of each other and everything also, but like they wanted to make their own names. Austen, I think, didn't hold out for putting her own name on the books. Because the thing that keeps coming up both in her letters and especially in her novels themselves is the mere, like the more simple and basic fact. Y'all need to start, y'all the literary book reading public need to start giving respect to novels in general, first and foremost, because novels were still the pulp fiction. Novels at the turn of the century, like in 1800, novels still had the status that like fantasy has nowadays. Right. Basically, where it was mainstream, it was super popular, everybody loved it, but it didn't get official respect.
Yep.
Right. It was still just considered genre. Right. You read, you discussed poetry if you were really one of the literary elite, just like if you were one, if you're one of the literary elite now, like 20th century literary elite, you don't discuss Tolkien, you discuss Joyce or T.S. Eliot or even Jack Kerouac or something like that. But you don't discuss fantasy literature because that's not serious literature, right? And in the same way, novels as a genre were not considered serious literature. So her first stance is novels are great literature. Novels are art, and they are art of as estimable a quality as any other kind of literary work that there is. But then as like a subset of that thing that she was trying to prove was novels by women are just as good as novels by men. So, because if you, again, like with fantasy literature, and again, this has been changing, but I mean, certainly 20 years ago, if you were reading a work of fantasy literature, if somebody caught you reading a fantasy book in public, there would have been a tendency to try to make an excuse for it.
Or a fake cover that you put
on. Or a fake
top.
cover. Yeah.
That was like a real thing for a while.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Didn't the Harry Potter books come out with like grown-up covers? Yeah, so that you could read it and not get made fun of?
Black and white photography.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That is the same impulse that people who were reading novels in 1800, like, 1800, 1820, would have. If they're reading something, they would just... I mean, this scene comes up in Pride and Prejudice when Mr. Collins comes to the house and they ask him about if he's read the latest novel, and he's like, oh, I never read novels. And they're like, oh no, let's read from this collection of sermons instead. Like that's what you would literally like pretend you were reading a published collection of sermons instead of reading a novel, just as you would pretend you were reading I don't know what, the Odyssey instead of
with a comic book inside of it.
Yeah, with a comic book inside of it. Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. So she was trying to break through that, first and foremost, but it would be like doubly bad. It would be doubly, it's like you're not only caught reading a fantasy novel, you're caught reading an explicitly YA fantasy novel, right? Yeah. Like, again, like the Harry Potter situation, right? Or something like a book that's come up on this show several times that I love and think is a wonderful book, How to Train Your Dragon, right? Yeah. It's explicitly written for younger audiences and has all of the trappings of a book written for younger audiences. And yet, so like a grown-up reading that novel on the subway might feel a little sheepish, right? And so similarly, like again, that not only a novel, but a novel by a woman would have been like a double whammy, culturally
Right.
speaking, in that sense. And so those things seem to me to be the things that come up. Those are the things that come up with Austen again and again. So if there's something she's trying to prove, if there's an axe she's grinding, that's her main. That's her primary axe. Those two, the chief novel axe and the subset, the sub axe of novels by women, were really sort of the big deal.
I also feel the need to just say, like, we seem off topic, but this is like what Corey and I do to kind of come to ideas as well. So, like,
Yeah.
I feel like it's just an important note of like, this is probably a more diluted development discussion than we normally have. But, the way that we kind of talk around some of this stuff and think through certain ideas, like, you do start to think about what would be really good in an episode, right? So,
Yes.
just hearing you kind of muse on these ideas and ask questions and get curious, that makes a piece stronger. That makes a piece much more interesting and engaging because we're interested and engaged. But, just thinking back to some of the stuff that you were saying of like, we now have primary source example of world building from an author. Like, we didn't have that before. I
Yeah.
hope you took a picture so we can quote it specifically. Like,
For sure, I did.
excellent. So things like that, and like any pictures you did take, send over, or we'll start a folder, and like that can be overlay that we can put into some of this kind of foundation lane, or you never know where it could go. So like the fact that you now have a bunch of pictures, and it's making me want to like go see her grave and see some of the sites over here, of maybe that can be B-roll footage that gets overlaid into some of these episodes, because we're going to be talking about audience reception and context, and this is a film made for a modern audience, but a book told for a Regency audience. What kind of changes and differences can we see? And what can you and I show on this to kind of illustrate that? Like, you can see where some of this goes. So while sometimes some of these conversations may seem like, guys, just get back to it, start talking about it. It's like, no, this is important stuff too, because
Yeah.
you don't know where it's going to go.
Yes.
Thing I'm worried about is I haven't taken notes on all of this because I was just interested. So, well, luckily it's recorded and we can go
Yeah.
back to it if
Yeah.
we need to.
Yeah. We can come back around to it.
Do you have other things from the exhibit you want to
No,
share?
those are the main things. Those apart from the fact that she's hilarious and her letters are so funny. I just really enjoy.
I want to see if it's going anywhere else. Like, is it going to come here?
Maybe. I
It
think
should,
probably. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was quiet. It's not a big exhibit, so
Yeah.
it's like it's not wasn't. It was one room,
Cool, though.
basically, but it was very cool. So it's not like it requires lots of real estate or something like that.
Yeah. Not like the Lord of the Rings exhibit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Though, I mean, it was not in the same room, by the way, for people who saw the Tolkien exhibit in the Morgan. The Tolkien exhibit in the Morgan was much larger and in a different room for that reason.
Yeah.
But,
Cool.
yeah.
So, going back to some of our structure, I want to keep all of this in mind because primary source data is so rare anyway. And the fact that you're talking about something that is hundreds of years old is unreal, that we have like a new thing to think about, and
Yeah.
that's really fun.
No, it was great.
I did try to turn this is first draft, so everybody hold your judgment. Um, but let me pull up the oops. Go away. No, I don't want to leave meeting. Um, multitasking. I tried to put some of our notes from last time into a new document and start to do a little bit of like episode outline. So this is what I would attempt to do if we were shooting this like in the studio, but this is very basic bullet points. But I was thinking like we might want to start thinking about stuff like this and populating it a little bit and adding our own actual bullet points, not just the things that I could glean from the messy notes that I took.
Right.
And that's what we would go off of to actually record an episode. So this is just episode 1 introduction, setting the stage, context and background. What is adaptation, imagination versus image, taking a look at different bits. We can go through each of these, but you can just get an idea of like Character reveal, let's take a look at Lydia as a case study. Emotional dynamics, let's take a look at Lizzie and Mr. Bennet. Let's take a look at the ball scene with Darcy's slight. I think we might want to move this earlier, but like just mentioning behind the scenes and, how we kind of know a lot about production and does that affect reception, and then just kind of wrapping it up. So it feels a little blunt doing it like this. So now we need to like bring a little bit more life back into an outline,
Right.
and have it have a little bit more of the meat that we've been talking about. So I still have the other one open here with some of the other thoughts and messiness, but attempting to make it a bit tidier.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. So let me kind of think through this
Yeah.
again. So we've got like general introduction, and then setting the stage. Okay. So setting the stage is, so going down to section 1. That's where we're going to be talking about like the moments, the occasions, like what were these things? What are these things? What does this mean? Because it's one thing to say Pride and Prejudice is a book, but what does that mean? You can say one's a book, one's a miniseries, one's a movie, right? But okay, more, right?
Yeah.
More on each one of those things. Yeah. By the way, another little tidbit: each of her novels was published in multiple volumes.
What?
Yeah, they're published in multiple volumes. Pride and Prejudice was 3 volumes, I'm pretty sure. Sense and Sensibility was 3 volumes, and they're small. They're designed to be small, like, because the assumption is most of the people reading them are women, right? And so you can fit it in your little like
Tiny little pocketbook.
your tiny little pocketbook, that you carry with you, so you can be somewhere and you can whip out your volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice, which is what you're on, and whatever, and you can. So that was multiple volume publications was very, very common in those days.
Really, that was also a sales decision, right? Because you wouldn't just buy the first one; you'd have to buy 3.
You'd have to buy 3, yeah, and they're all like leather bound separately. So I mean, presumably it jacks the price to have them be 3 volumes, but it does keep the size of the book smaller, so that instead of having and those books are not huge, right? I mean, it's not like, again, Pride and Prejudice isn't a long book, but you could have. But it's even easier to carry around, at least the part that you're currently reading, right? If it's in 3 small volumes. So again, even the physical like artifact, right, of the original edition says something interesting about like what it was and how they imagined it being read, right?
Very cool.
Okay. Anyway, so we've got and then we can talk about the BBC miniseries, what it meant that it was not just like the 1995 BBC miniseries. We can talk about all 3 of those terms, right?
I know, right?
It's a miniseries, BBC, 1995, right? Yeah. I'm
like, don't go too far ahead. I mean, I kind of think it's fine for us to get hung up on some small points to just flesh this out, because this is just like, things we've talked about, but there's no heart or meat in any of this. So like, what do we want to say about these things?
Yeah, I think so. In setting the stage, just trying to understand, because one of the points about studying adaptations is considering each for the unique work of art that it is, right?
Yes.
And yes, they are importantly related one to another, but we need to understand the 1995 BBC miniseries is not just a visual adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, any more than the 1813 Pride and Prejudice was just a story. Like, both of those things are true. Like, one is a story, the other is a visual adaptation of Jane Austen, but one was also a novel in 3 volumes by a lady, the author of Sense and Sensibility, right?
Yeah.
And the other was a 1995 BBC miniseries, right? And that's important. That matters. That impacts
Yeah.
what those two things were as works of art. I mean, honestly, if Jane Austen had written Pride and Prejudice in 1775 instead of 18, instead of the 1800s, it would have been different. Had she been writing it in 1870 instead of in 1810, it probably would have been different, right? So it's important, like the where that is in like the scope and the history of that art matters. The fact that that miniseries was a miniseries, that it was produced by the BBC, and that it was released when it was in 1995 matters.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the feature film came out 10 years later, after the BBC miniseries, had already established this. But they're going to do another major production of Pride and Prejudice designed for cinematic release in America is important, right? That's an important piece. Those three, all, those three terms as well, like American feature film in 2015. Those are important pieces of context to bring in. So we don't need to say we don't need to spend ages and ages on this setting the stage part. But I think that's a really, because then after that, generalizing outwards as you're suggesting, just a little bit below that, talking about expectations, right? What expectations were attached to it, and what kind of audiences they were speaking to, right? Yeah, I think it's pretty significant. So, like, for instance, do you think, as I suspect, that the Keira Knightley film, when they were making that film, they were not assuming familiarity with Austen with many of their audience? Where, like, or let me say it this way: I bet you that the percentage of audience members familiar with Austen that they were anticipating was much lower than the percentage that the 95 miniseries was expecting. The BBC miniseries was expecting that not all, but many of their viewers.
Yeah. And I feel like that's also like British versus American.
Yeah,
Sure.
for
Austen
sure.
is better known in the UK than she is in the
Taught
US.
in more
Even
schools. Yeah.
even before both of these adaptations existed, when it was just books out
Yes.
there. Yes, there were some previous adaptations, but like mainstream ones, I think we can say that pretty solidly. Then there's also the form. So BBC, Jane Austen, long form on TV at general consumption with 4 TV channels that is widely consumed by people who are familiar with Jane Austen. Like you said, had to study him in school. Like everybody has a baseline understanding. I think the US, like maybe they weren't saying like, oh, Americans are ignorant, no one's ever heard of her, but they're probably assuming they don't have the same like household name
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah. And that they were self-consciously thinking, we are going to be we want, to make a whole new generation of people who know nothing about Jane Austen fall in love with this story. Has to have been
Yeah,
one of their
and I
motivations,
was gonna
right?
say for it to not matter, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're really just trying to tell this good story, and they're not trying to educate you about Jane Austen. They're trying to tell
Yes.
you a good story.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Not that the BBC weren't trying to tell a good story, but exactly that kind of thing. I mean, I have to think, given the America versus UK thing, just for starters, and the cinematic release versus BBC secondarily, like I would have to think that were the case, and that's something that we have to understand as one of the premises, right? Yeah.
I think, yeah, I'm putting a note for research this on there because I feel like if we can pull in a little bit of research there, that might
Yeah,
be a
that
little
would
bit
be
more
good.
impactful.
That would be good. Um, yeah, yeah. Um,
There's also the thought of like preconceptions. So you wouldn't make a feature film in 2005 without a discussion in the room at the very least of the one that existed 10 years prior. Like,
Yes.
it had to have been formative in
Had to
how
have
they
been.
created it. Whether it was purposely referenced, and I don't mean references in like we're going to put a footnote. I mean, like, there might be some moments in the BBC version that they were like, that captured that feeling. Like,
And
I'm
we have
thinking
to try
about
to recapture that in some
like
way.
the
Yeah.
hand touch in the Keira Knightley one. Like, what was that moment
Yeah.
in BBC one that had the same kind of energy? And, the wet shirt moment versus the strutting across the field moment. Like, there's a
Yes.
few things that you can see, like, maybe they were vibing the same way.
Yes.
So if there's probably some influence of it leading into it.
Yes. No, there has to be. I mean, um, it is very like, I mean, I have to think that that is very like, in some senses, perhaps even more like the relationship between the Rings of Power and the Peter Jackson films, right?
Hmm.
Um, uh, what are you looking at here?
Sorry, I'm typing up notes and I'm trying to do it very quietly. So I'm like,
Yeah,
what?
yeah. Um, yeah. Oh no, yeah. I think it's very similar. Okay, so just let's continue skimming down. So section two.
Okay.
I know we're not exactly filling this out into bullet points, but I'm thinking through to see how well this outline works, and I like that beginning. So then we come to what is adaptation doing?
Imagination versus image was like a thing I'm trying to hang it on, but I don't want to get lost into titling things yet. But I think like how we are picturing something versus how we are viewing something is where I was going with that.
Mm-hmm.
So the same kind of thing that you were saying, I love having that primary example now that we can pull something like that in here. Maybe a little bit of explanation with stuff like this that we're able to kind of demonstrate what we're talking about, that visual language, we're building the world, film,
Yes.
we're being shown the world,
Yes.
and then having a couple of examples in there. And I don't want to get like too lost in terminology, but it's a great opportunity to show some of the research side of it.
Yes. Yes.
And Longburn's one that we talked about before, and I think that would be fun because they are so different. And
Right. How does she convey what Longbourn is like?
mhm.
Um, yes. Yes. So we're thinking about. Hmm, this is about world building, but it is more about. Uh, is this more about kind of how information is conveyed, essentially? Like
Mhm.
how. Um, yeah, I mean, I do like the imagination versus image thing
Okay.
because um, the necessity of the reader's active involvement in using one's own imagination as you're reading. Um, like books pretty much don't work without that. And like people got a very different layers, right? Like there's some people who don't really form clear mental pictures of characters, for
Yeah.
instance. There's some people who have really clear pictures, right? And will draw pictures and stuff like that, right? But there are some people who don't. But yet, whether you do or whether you don't populate it with like very specific mental pictures, you still do, like, you are using your imagination. You are making the book come alive in your own mind,
Right.
um, in whatever way works best for you, right? Whatever that looks like. And that can be really, really flexible, whether you're picturing something that might look like a movie in your head or whether you're doing that otherwise. And by the way, that's another thing, which of course I think is impossible to study, but which I would be really interested to see, like how
Yeah.
watching films has impact, like the extent to which we are picturing cinematic scenes in our heads now,
Yep.
even when we're reading pre-cinematic books, right? When you're reading Jane Austen yourself, are you doing your own internal adaptation that looks like it could be a film?
Well, of course you are, because yeah, and just in terms of like the knowledge of things that we have now, like if you tell me it's a Regency setting with a carriage, I'm immediately going to picture that image from the 2005 of the carriage going across that like blue filter dark. Like you have all these
Right,
preconceptions because of the stuff we've taken in. The
right,
same way AI is picking and choosing and creating something new, so are we, just with
right,
our brains.
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think so. But again, it's like how wholesale is it? Like how wholesale is the um like I think that some people, like especially people who are like film and TV lovers who read books also, I think often are like shooting the movie in their heads while they're reading, you know. Um Whereas others I think don't still. Um there's a lot that I don't think that I picture myself. Like I'm
Hmm.
not a visual person. That's why I love
Okay.
audiobooks so much, and I do all of my reading by audio because audio is enough for me. And I'm not a very visual person, and I do picture characters in my head, kind of, but I don't have really strong opinions
Uh-huh.
necessarily about what they should look like. I'll have general things, but not like um, not very not. I don't know. It varies, but
I know what you mean. Yeah, and like I think of myself as a super visual person, but when I'm reading, I don't really do that. Even if there is a physical description, it doesn't necessarily like overhaul right and wrong that if I saw somebody depicted in a film, I don't think it would be so sharp in my brain that I wouldn't be receptive to like what was in front of me.
hmm hmm
So all of this to say, like, it's a lot of what we've talked about before, but like we have to assume the same way that the U.S. film was assuming that people weren't familiar with Jane Austen, we should assume because this is our own exercise that people are not familiar with us.
right,
So
exactly,
this is a way for us to give kind of a really general overview of here are some of the pitfalls of adaptation.
right.
Here are some of the thoughts that you need to keep in mind. And we are going to give you a little bit of a primer overview. But we'll try to do it in a very specific to this
Yeah.
story way.
So what we're doing here in large part in this section is kind of just trying to draw attention to the fundamental, not just differences in technique, but the fundamental differences in like what it means for these two things to be different genres,
Hmm.
essentially, right? Like how does the written word convey story, and how compared to how a visual production compares story.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
So, I mean, specific sections like we're starting with terminology, we're giving an example. I feel like we're missing some tricks though, because there's so much more like so much stuff that we reference up in this section
hmm
that I think's really playing into this section. So maybe we can pull a couple of these deep thoughts from section one into section two as well.
yeah. So I feel like the first section is about what are these three what are these three works of art?
Yeah, yeah.
Like what are they and what are they trying to be? What do we know about that? Right. Um, what in kind of general terms are they trying to accomplish? In
Hmm.
section two, we're shifting to how can they accomplish it? Like how do these two genres operate differently? In section two, are we going to try to distinguish at all between TV and movie? So the thing that strikes me as a section two esque kind of difference between TV and movie, um, more than scope or anything, is screen size,
Yeah.
right?
Screen size and screen time
Yeah.
and commercial breaks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Although BBC was really good about not having that situation, but six, it's 6 episodes, right? It's not five.
Six
Six.
episodes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
6 episodes is still a cinematic no. It's very, very much a TV ask to
Right.
have someone sit down for that.
Right.
So yeah, I think structure. So TV versus film,
So
structure versus.
book, TV versus film. So there's the fundamental distinction between the written word and the visual image. But then within the two visual image things, there are quite different things. The impact of pictures on the screen are going to be different when you're watching a 50-foot screen
Yeah.
than it will be when you're watching your own 1995 television.
And along with that goes, I'm watching it in a living room on a tiny TV with my whole family.
Yes.
And my mom put the kettle on in the kitchen, and my dog is barking at the mailman that just came to the door. In a cinema, doors are shut, lights are down.
Yes.
Yes, sometimes you have some interruptions, but it's a very different viewing experience.
And the sound, right?
Yeah.
What you get in a theater compared to, I mean, like what the kind of impact that a soundtrack can have. Not that obviously not that has no impact on TV, but again, it's just going to be different because you have no control, or very little control over the sound experience that the audience is going to have. Whereas again, in a theater situation, you can be more, I mean, even like something just as simple as stereo sound, right? Like you can't, in 1995 especially, you can't count on anybody to have stereo sound.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have an actual TV set in 95 with sound coming out of it. I mean, so yeah, that's, yeah. So anyway, that's, I think that's worth talking about here too, in talking about, as well as that fundamental difference between written and visual. We could, I mean, with the visuals, we have the two different to compare and contrast. We don't have any other direct thing to compare or contrast Austen's novel with, nor do we exactly need one. But again, I think that even there, like, what kind of storytelling is this? Like, it is a novel. Like, that will have been some of the, we can build on a little bit of the stuff I think we talk about in section 1 there, to talk about, how it's consumed and what they can expect and everything. I mean, it is interesting, right? To some extent, the fact that this was a work, one of whose volumes you could tuck into your pocketbook, is kind of equivalent to a TV show you're watching in your living room,
Yeah. Or now on your phone,
Right.
like
Right.
absolutely.
Right.
I like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah.
Adaptation.
And so again, like when she is trying to connect with the imagination of her readers, she is, yeah. Well, I have to be careful here because I'm not 100%. No. Okay. I was just going to say I'm not 100% sure what she was anticipating it would look like. She didn't know what it was going to be published like, but Sense and Sensibility was already published. She had other novels.
She had her own.
Yeah.
She had her own preconception from her own experience.
Exactly. She would have assumed it was going to look something like Fanny Burney's novel. So yeah, she would have had her own preconceptions. Anyway, okay. So the transition then to section 3. So I like the transition from 1 to 2.
2 makes sense.
The transition to 3 is, we're talking about showing and telling. And again, so here now we're looking at specific techniques. Given these differences, so like understanding the different kinds of artworks these 3 things are, the different kinds of circumstances in which they're operating, right? The different kind of physical parameters, right, in which they're operating. Now let's do, so this is the first time we're going to really dig into a side-by-side comparison, right? And say, let's look at the different techniques that they use and how those techniques are operating.
I think we need to be super clear about what we're showing and why we're showing it. So we are taking a look at two specific elements from the early stages of Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah.
In order to illustrate how the same thing can be shown so many different ways. And even within the text itself, how that could be interpreted different ways. Like, these are not the only two ways.
Right.
There are millions.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So we think about Austen's storytelling and we think about their storytelling and we look at the relationship between the story that they're telling and the way that they're telling it and the story that Austen is telling it. So basically we're doing kind of two levels of comparison here with this. But your screen keeps doing this weird flickering thing. You're not seeing anything flickering? I am on Zoom. It's weird.
Oh no, I'm not.
It's doing a flickering thing. I don't know what.
I'm sorry.
No, I think it's a Zoom issue of some sort. It's weird. Anyway, it's fine. Never mind. I don't know. I just hope it doesn't cause anybody seizures or something. Yeah. No, but we're seeing we're seeing your whole screen. So when you switch over there, we'll see it. But
going back to see if it was flickering over here.
Well, you won't now because now you're seeing the Mobius strip of us. But anyway, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. It's fine.
If there's a thing I can do to solve it, let me know. But no, mine's not flickering.
I have no idea why. It seemed to be a Zoom issue. But whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, Phil was just noticing the flickering as well. I don't know.
Oh no.
But in any case, we'll see if it persists. If it does persist, I can shift to just showing myself.
It's usually easier if I do this because Corey is juggling 17 other things with all the platforms we
on the different screens. Yeah, I can make it work, but we'll figure it out. Okay. Anyway, all right. So anyway, I think there are two different things ultimately that we're comparing in in section 3. One is how do the storytelling techniques differ? Like, what are the similarities and differences in the storytelling techniques within the novel and within the visual adaptations, and differences among those two as well, potentially. Though I think they're more likely to be sort of more unified as like a visual adaptation versus a written adaptation. But then having done that at the same time, we're wanting to compare, as you say, interpretations, right? Given the cues, given the techniques that Austen does use in order to convey information about something like Lydia's character. It's not just what techniques do the visual productions use in order to convey that information. It's what information are they getting? Like, what interpretations are they making? What interpretive choices have they made that underlie their use of whatever techniques they are using, right, in order to do that? And that's a different question, but it's a closely related question, right? That I think we can kind of set up both.
Yeah, and I think the technique is a thing to focus on, and I think that's a really good differentiation of, like, we're not going to fall into the trap of look what's different.
Yes.
Look what's different from book to film. But we have to look at what's different from book to film in order to illustrate a technique, right? So, like, it's okay, and I want to, like, have that be part of it, to be like, yes, it's very natural for us to just compare. You have to compare. That's how we interpret this stuff. But we're not just doing it in order to go, see, it's different. We're doing it in order to say, see, it's different.
Yeah.
So I think, all of this feels like we're in a bit of a defense, but that's not really my goal. But
no, it isn't. And it is
what we're getting into.
It is hard not to sound defensive when you're speaking to a frequently hostile audience.
Yes.
Right? Like
we're so jilted by things being thrown at us.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so now I'm thinking that we do section 3 in like 2 movements, basically. We transition in the transition in, which is essentially, so now let's look at the techniques. And that builds directly off of section 2, right, where we've been looking at like the imagination versus image, right? We've just been talking in those terms. How are they capturing these? What are the parameters that they're having to deal with, right? What are the tools that they have available to them, right? And how do those tools differ? Like again, the way that the 1995 Pride and Prejudice can presume upon your patients that you're going to be sticking around for 6 hours, right? Compared to the parameter that the 2005 film can assume that you're going to be able to have stereo sound, right? And then you've got, again, the book being able to draw upon the power of your own imagination, like and so in this sense, of course, the special effects budgets of books are infinite, right? Because they can call upon your own imagination. They just have to be able to do that, right? So we've established those parameters. So the first part of section 3 is basically being like, so let's illustrate what that means. Let's see what that looks like, right? What are the techniques that so here's a thing that needs to happen. This character needs to be introduced. What are the techniques that Jane Austen uses in order to do that? What are the techniques that they use, that the films use in order to do that? And we don't even draw attention at first to the changes, right? We're just talking about the techniques, right? Look at how they tell their stories. Look at how they accomplish this goal, right? Then afterwards, we're like, and of course, you can't help but notice when you see these things that they've made interpretive choices, right? They have to make interpretive choices. And then we can talk about the interpretive choices that are being made, right? And how those things connect with and become a part of the storytelling art of those things, right? I think that would flow pretty well.
I can see that. I feel like there needs to be a little bit more fleshing out in that section, but the points are solid of like, we're going to start to give you some examples. And it also gives a brief kind of expectation example. Sorry, it's getting really late. And I'm like, well, expectation example of what we're going to be doing in future episodes. So like, here's what you can expect from us. We're going to tell you this thing and we're going to show you this thing, just like she is showing and telling.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so the next section then. So we transition from here to basically trying to show how something more complex and abstract is being conveyed.
Right. And using some different techniques. So like I haven't done the film analysis for this yet, so like I feel like that will start to show itself a little bit more clearly once I deep dive into watching some of this, which I was thinking about. Like I could try to live stream some of that if it's of interest to people, of just me watching something over and over again and going through shot analysis and stuff. But it'd be pretty boring, but maybe I could condense it down to like streamlined version.
I don't know. That kind of sounds like fun, actually.
I do enjoy it. And I did one of the Rings of Power one with somebody in our crew sitting next to me, and it was really fun because we just like talked through as I did it. But yes, anyway, so going through some of that stuff and starting to see a little bit more of the depth of what we're talking about, because it's hard to write an outline for something like that, because that's where you start to be like, ooh, there's a little shift of elbow there, and therefore I interpret thus. And I feel like we can start to play a little bit more there with how the story is shown.
Yeah, there seems to be a certain amount of enthusiasm for this idea. Mrs. Manrique is excited about this on YouTube. So yes, yeah. No, let's definitely think about that. So okay, so I'm trying to push because I want to get through this outline today, because I think this is great to kind of discuss this through and make a clear plan. So so we have two examples here of. So having looked at like a simple, not a simplified, but a simple example of how now we see these storytelling techniques taking place with a much more complicated data point, right? And so we're giving two of these, Lizzie and Mr. Bennet and their relationship. Like, how do you convey what the relationship between Elizabeth and her father is at the beginning of the book? And then the ball scene, Darcy's feelings and Elizabeth's reactions. thinking about that and how the story, because these are not only more complicated. So it's interesting because I love these two. I love these two examples. I love how this works as you've shaped it here together, because Lizzie and Mr. Bennet is in scale. It's kind of similar to the introducing Lydia example, right? But it's more abstract, right? It's like, how do two people connect with each other instead of just what is a person like, right? Which is not a simple thing itself, but it's not as, but this is more complicated. It's more intangible, right? So it's like a really good single step up, but then we're doing the same thing, but now we're doing it like for all the marbles, because this scene matters hugely, right? If the first ball scene with Darcy and Lizzie falls flat, our story's going to have a big problem, right? Like, you've got to win that scene. You've got to accomplish that. So now we're seeing how they do it when everything's on the line, right? Yeah. When you're introducing the central storyline of the story, the relationship between Lizzie and Darcy. So yes, I really like that. And I think the transition from general techniques to the specific, to then the interpretive choices, then sets us up to be able to talk about both of those things freely.
Yeah, and I kind of think those are the two big arms in adaptation. So like, when we are defensive and we are fighting those battles, we have the people that are like, see, this is exactly what it says in the text and this is why the film is wrong.
Right.
So like, we have the practical, Harry's eyes are supposed to be green and Dan Radcliffe's are blue. Sure, that's a specific. Right. But then we have this more emotional, the grief of his parents is what drove him to drive forward in the story. Like, there's got to be this, hi Marilyn, more difficult to establish, really, like the emotional, and I've added relationship in there because, just like you said, like, a relationship is not something that you can point for point describe from a text to a film, because we can't do it in real life. Why on earth would we be able to do it in a screen? So we have the first level of like very factual adaptation, and then this second level of emotional relationship. There's different ways to get that feeling, that idea, that winning the scene feeling,
right. Right. Yes. 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 Agreed. Okay. Right. Now,
so for each of these, we'll have to think about how we do it, because I'm thinking it would probably be similar to like what we do with Rings and Realms. Like, I would wait for Corey's scripts and then usually do my film analysis off of it. We know already which scenes I'm going to be doing film analysis, so I can do some of the like the black and white stuff. I can do some of the like tear it apart. But depending on kind of what you want to discuss in the text, and we should probably do that together. So maybe that's next week we look at textual examples and then start looking at some of the stills.
You know what occurs to me?
What's that?
It would be really fun to have some volunteer contributors helping us with this.
Ooh.
Wouldn't it be fun to have people who could, like, when we're talking, create sets of notes from our episodes that we could then use and incorporate?
Yes, it would.
Because I'm thinking, like, I would love to be able to just kind of to be able to talk through stuff. And it's going to be hard.
Yeah, and not be distracted about taking the notes down.
Right. Not being distracted by actually writing a set of notes. I can just talk. That's how I think best anyway. Yeah. Anyway, so it just occurs to me, if anyone who is listening would be interested in participating in helping us to kind of make notes and keep things together, you should get in touch. What's that email address? Studios at? Is that
studios at
signumu.org, right?
Hang on, we're gonna find out.
Yes, yep. Studios at signumu.org. Yeah. No, send us an email. Yeah.
Yeah, and for that, like, I mean, yes, we know there's software for that and stuff, but like having a human kind of listen to us that knows us as well.
Yeah, and just I would value that. Yeah.
And kind of taking a tab on the conversation as well, because sometimes there's stuff that like people come up with in the chat, and like hearing us talk about something and somebody reacts to it,
Yes.
you might pull something out of that. So having
Yeah.
a human is useful.
Yeah, it is useful.
Cool. Drop me a line.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now section 5.
I don't know if we need this. I feel like it needs to be mentioned because
I think we're basically integrating that into section 1.
I think so too. I think this is actually part of section one, but maybe
Yeah.
it's like 1 point A, or however we.
Yeah. We need to take yeah, to take into account both what we know of the historical moment and what
Yeah.
they've said about it, what they've said about the process and what we understand about that. But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, right, because then after this, section 6 is simply a bringing together and a wrap up, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Is there
and
anything else to take a step back? Is there anything else that you guys or you, Corey, think we need to cover in an intro session? Like, obviously, we have to introduce ourselves. I didn't really put that in here. Um, but we'd have to introduce ourselves, what we want to do. Like, I can kind of sketch that part out.
yeah, that can
But
be
then,
in the very opening intro thing,
yeah.
right?
But then just going through all of this, we have, what are the things we're looking at? What is an adaptation doing? A little bit of a case study, a much deeper case study, and then okay, that's a bit of a hint about what we're going to do. Next week we're going to actually start digging deep into and give the specific examples for the next episode.
Yes. Yeah. Um, yes, that makes sense. Uh, yeah, that does make sense. I think I think that will work. I'm trying to like keep in mind that this first session is designed to be not like we're still going to be able to talk about the opening of the films afterwards. Like this is designed to be more case studies and groundwork
This
laying.
is like showing them the agenda
Right.
with a few footnotes.
Right.
Like
Right.
this is what this lecture series is going to give you. This is the orientation episode.
Right. Okay. Yep.
So we give them a few little morsels to hang on to. And I'm also thinking about it in terms of just like, if there were a studio that would take a look at it in this episode, they would understand what we're trying to do and have a few
Right.
smaller moments
Right.
to see it in action.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's good. Okay. So then let's plan on next time. Next time, let's plan on uh, let's plan on watching. Let's plan on doing that watch along next time. Um,
And the textual read along. Like I want to read the specific because I haven't even
yeah.
read the specific description of Longbourn and then look at the two examples and let alone
And
Lydia and her dad and everything else.
and our homework can be, you can come in with specific scenes that we should be looking at, and I will come in with specific book passages we should be looking at.
Which means I need timestamps and you need page numbers.
Yep. Exactly.
Look, it knows you're Olsen.
Awesome. Yep. That's what we can do.
That's also handy because then that already would give us the visuals of the text that we would
Yeah.
overlay and be able to put alongside this.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, we are over time, but that was really helpful. I feel like this is much clearer now, and I think that for next time we'll do the rest of our thinking and do a bunch more of our detailed analysis, and then we'll have everything sorted.
Excellent. That feels like a proper little structure, doesn't it?
It
But
does.
we got to start with like you musing over wonderful things that you saw. So
Yeah, that was
Sharon
us.
also sent me
I
a
was
link.
thinking of all y'all when I was there at the exhibit. I'm like, this is so cool. I can't wait to tell people about this stuff.
I love it. Sharon also sent me a link while we were chatting of the exhibit itself, and you can download a bunch of images from it.
Yeah.
So we have access to that, which is great.
Yes.
But also we can see if we can stick that in like the YouTube description for this episode, so you guys can see it if you
Yeah.
want.
And I did take a bunch of pictures myself too. So
On a few of you too.
yeah.
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 So cool.
Awesome. Very
Awesome.
good. Well, thanks everybody for listening and for joining us today. And we will look forward to next time, to doing some more detailed analysis next time. Very good.
Take
Thanks
care, guys.
everybody.
See ya.
Bye now.
Bye.